Delilah Hart pushed through the towering glass doors of Cole Enterprises with her heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear the receptionist's greeting, her palms damp against the manila folder clutched to her chest like a life raft. The building loomed like a cathedral of power, steel and marble whispering secrets of the ultra-elite. Her first day as a junior assistant in the finance department was supposed to be uneventful, routine, survivable, but one wrong turn changed everything. Distracted by nerves and flustered by a malfunctioning floor panel in the elevator, she pressed the wrong button and shot upward toward a level she had no business reaching. The moment the doors opened to the top floor, a hushed, intimidating silence greeted her, so unlike the buzzing lower levels she had seen on her interview day. Desperate to be punctual, she stepped into the suite, mistaking it for an executive conference room. But this was no ordinary office. It was architectural perfection. Polished black floors, minimalist furniture, sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a godlike view of the skyline. And at the center of it all sat Everett Cole, the elusive billionaire CEO known for his brilliance and cold efficiency, a man the media dubbed the Ice King. He looked up, blue eyes narrowing slightly, not with anger, but curiosity. Delilah froze mid-step, her heels making a tiny, unintentional squeak as her mouth parted in horror. I, uh, I think I'm lost, she stammered, clutching her resume tighter, papers slightly askew. Everett didn't speak at first. He merely observed her, this frazzled young woman in a modest navy blouse and pencil skirt, clearly unprepared for the scrutiny of a man who'd built an empire by 28. When she finally dared to meet his gaze, something flickered behind his expression. Was it amusement? Recognition? Even he didn't know. She began to ramble, cheeks flushed with a pink hue that betrayed every anxious heartbeat, words spilling out faster than she could catch them. I'm supposed to be in the finance wing. I mean, level 22, but the elevator, and I think I pressed. I didn't mean to walk into your. I mean, this isn't HR, is it? Her voice trembled, not just from embarrassment, but from the heavy, almost magnetic energy of the room. Everett, usually intolerant of uninvited guests, leaned back slightly in his leather chair, his jaw tensing as if he were weighing something. Then, to everyone's shock, including his own, he raised a hand, signaling his assistant and the two department heads inside to leave them. The room emptied quickly, and Delilah stood frozen, unsure if she should apologize, run, or faint. Sit, he said simply, gesturing to the chair across from him. It wasn't a command. It was something softer, almost human. She obeyed, legs shaking beneath her skirt, trying desperately to hold herself together. He asked her name, and when she replied, his gaze lingered on her as if committing it to memory. There was something about her. No polished accent, no designer perfume, just raw sincerity and disarming honesty, the kind people didn't show him anymore. You're not from the city, are you? He asked, and she nodded, whispering that she'd just moved from a small town in Oregon, chasing a better life. He didn't smile, but his eyes did, just for a moment. The conversation was brief, almost mechanical on the surface, yet beneath it pulsed something intangible. When Delilah stood to leave, her hair falling loose from its clip, Everett found himself watching her differently, as though something had just cracked in his otherwise impenetrable world. She left the office mumbling another apology, nearly walking into the closing elevator doors. He stared at the space she left behind, wondering why her nervous energy lingered like perfume. For the first time in years, he didn't immediately return to his laptop or business calls. Instead, Everett Cole sat in thoughtful silence, the memory of a flushed, wide-eyed girl replaying in his mind like a strange, beautiful glitch in his meticulously coded life. The door had barely slid shut behind Delilah when murmurs began to rustle through the polished hallways, like wind through leaves, subtle at first, then rising in volume as curious glances trailed her return to the finance department. She tried to shake the strange energy clinging to her, telling herself it was just a mix-up, a quirky story for later. But the air around her felt heavier, sharper, as though something unseen had shifted. Then came the whispers, hushed voices behind screens, lingering stares by the coffee station, nervous chuckles that quieted the moment she walked by. The CEO had summoned her again. Not HR, not her manager, Everett Cole, the billionaire who didn't speak to entry-level staff, had asked for her by name, and now her inbox pinged with a calendar invite marked with his initials. Panic tightened her chest, but curiosity gripped her just as fiercely. As she rode the elevator back to the top floor, this time with permission, she rehearsed every possible mistake she could have made, wondering if she'd signed the wrong document or left her resume somewhere incriminating. But when she entered, he didn't mention any errors. Instead, Everett pointed to a data-heavy report on his screen and asked for her opinion on a projection model. She blinked, caught off guard, and hesitated, then leaned forward and offered a quiet correction, followed by a suggestion backed by logic and intuition. He didn't interrupt her. He listened. Really listened. The more she spoke, the more the corners of his mouth twitched with something resembling surprise. And when she paused, fearing she'd overstepped, he merely nodded and asked another question. It wasn't a test of obedience, but of mind, and she passed. When she left the office again, her thoughts spun faster than her heels could carry her. Why was he noticing her? She was no different from the dozens of assistants who passed through this building every year. Yet Everett Cole had looked at her like she cracked open a part of the world he'd forgotten existed. Back at her desk, Delilah buried herself in spreadsheets, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just coincidence. But she began to feel eyes on her, not invasive, but observant. Later that afternoon, Everett passed through the floor above, claiming to check on department performance, but his gaze paused when she wasn't looking. He saw her staying past lunch, not because anyone asked, but because she cared. He watched her hold the elevator for a frail janitor named Carl, whom most ignored, and how she took the time to learn his name and ask about his arthritis. He noticed the way she jumped to help a fellow intern struggling with formulas, gently encouraging instead of scolding, even when it slowed her own work. She was not perfect, not polished like the women who frequented galas and charity balls on his arm, but there was an authenticity in her that disarmed him, a softness that didn't demand attention but commanded it all the same. Everett, who hadn't truly seen people in years, began to see her everywhere. In the quiet moments, in her small acts of defiance against cruelty, in her habit of tucking her hair behind her ear when deep in thought. She never smiled for show, only when something truly moved her, and that alone captivated him. That night, as she walked out of the building into the golden haze of city lights, unaware that his gaze followed her from a window above, he realized something deeply unsettling. Delilah Hart was no accident, no fluke or wrong door mistake. She had slipped through a crack in his carefully sealed world, and now that she had entered it, part of him wasn't sure he wanted her to leave. The days passed in a haze of normalcy, until the unexpected knock on Delilah's office door shattered the fragile calm she had carefully constructed. She had barely settled into her routine when her past walked through the doors in the form of Brad, her ex, his presence like an unwelcome ghost resurrected from the shadows of her old life. Her heart thudded in her chest, a mixture of dread and anger rising within her. Brad's smirk was the same as it had been when they were teenagers, charming, manipulative, and dangerous. He had always known how to press her buttons, how to convince her to ignore her instincts for the sake of a fleeting promise. His approach this time was more insidious, disguised as casual concern, but Delilah saw through it. He had heard about her job at Cole Enterprises and was here to remind her of everything she had fought to escape. He made a show of being supportive, but his words were coated in venom, designed to chip away at her newfound independence. "Come on, Delilah," he coaxed. "I know you're not really happy here. You're just using this job to run away from everything. You know how much I still care about you." Delilah clenched her fists under the desk, her breath shallow. He didn't know her, not anymore. She wasn't that scared girl who had bent to his every whim, who had sacrificed her own dreams to prop him up. But before she could send him away with the coldness he deserved, a familiar voice broke in. "Is there a problem here?" Everett's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it, something dark, something protective. He stood in the doorway, his eyes sharp and calculating. Without waiting for an answer, Everett stepped into the room, his presence an impenetrable force. Delilah felt her pulse quicken, the mix of emotions swirling inside her. She didn't need saving, but somehow in that moment, she wasn't sure how to handle the situation. Brad, sensing an opportunity, smirked and stepped forward, sizing Everett up. "And who's this? Your new boss?" he sneered. Everett didn't flinch, his gaze unwavering. "No, I'm her boyfriend," he said, his words low, measured, and shockingly confident. The declaration hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Brad's eyes narrowed, clearly thrown off balance by Everett's unexpected intervention, but he didn't back down. "That's cute. I guess you didn't tell him about all the things we used to do together, huh?" Brad's voice dripped with insinuation, and Delilah's stomach twisted in knots. But Everett wasn't rattled. Instead, he stepped closer to her, placing a protective hand on the edge of her desk, his body blocking her from Brad's invasive gaze. "I don't think she needs to explain herself to you," Everett said, his tone icy and deliberate. Brad hesitated, caught between his desire to assert dominance and the palpable threat in Everett's demeanor. With one last glance at Delilah, he turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath, and left. The tension in the room was thick enough to slice through with a knife, and Delilah could hardly breathe. She looked up at Everett, his jaw tight, his posture rigid, as if he had only just realized the weight of what he had done. "Why?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just transpired. Everett's gaze softened for a fraction of a second, something flickering behind his icy blue eyes. A vulnerability he didn't want her to see. "I didn't like the way he looked at you," he replied, the words heavier than she had expected. The vulnerability in his voice unsettled her, but it was quickly masked by his usual cool exterior. As he turned to leave, Delilah felt a strange flutter in her chest, the first stirrings of something she couldn't quite identify. She had always prided herself on being independent, on needing no one. But Everett's actions had cracked open a door she hadn't even known was there. Later, as she replayed the encounter in her mind, something began to shift in her understanding of him. Everett Cole, this man who had built a kingdom from the ground up, who had once sworn off attachments, had just done something for her that no one else ever had. He had protected her, not because he had to, but because, in that moment, he had wanted to. And that realization sent a shiver down her spine. For the first time, Delilah felt a flicker of something dangerous within Everett, a warmth buried beneath the cool walls he'd built around himself. And as much as she wanted to shut it out, as much as she tried to convince herself that she didn't need anyone, she couldn't deny the pull she felt every time his eyes lingered on her. The man who had never shown interest in anyone beyond his business had just shown her something raw, something real, and it both terrified and exhilarated her. The gala arrived like a wave crashing over Delilah, its gleaming lights and extravagant decor an overwhelming sight she wasn't sure she was ready for. Everett, always elusive when it came to social events, surprised her with a simple request that rattled her more than it should have. "Come with me," he had said, voice unexpectedly gentle. "It's for appearances. You'll be my personal guest." Delilah had almost wondered if she had heard him wrong. A personal guest? For the billionaire CEO of Cole Enterprises, who had never shown a hint of interest in anything outside his business? But when she saw the way his eyes lingered, something shifted. There was no reason for him to ask, except that he wanted her there. So she had agreed. As the night of the gala approached, Delilah couldn't decide if she was excited or terrified. She had no intention of standing out, just wearing a simple red gown that fit perfectly, but understated her beauty. But the moment she stepped into the grand ballroom, the entire room seemed to pause. Eyes shifted, murmurs floated through the air, and Delilah felt an unfamiliar warmth bloom in her chest. Her gaze naturally moved to Everett, and when their eyes met, she saw it. Something she hadn't expected from him. Desire. It was as if he couldn't tear his gaze away from her, his usually steely blue eyes softening with something unspoken. She hadn't realized the effect she had on him. The energy in the room shifted. Delilah had never been one to care about appearances. But this night was different. She wasn't just the assistant to the man who ran this empire. She was his equal, his partner for the night. And as she moved through the crowd, it was clear she wasn't the only one who had noticed it. But just as the evening began to feel like a dream, reality came crashing in. Everett's ex-fiancée, Cecilia Blake, arrived in a flurry of diamonds and designer gowns. Delilah saw her before she even knew what was happening. A woman so poised that it was almost intimidating. She walked toward Everett with that unmistakable confidence only someone who once held his heart could possess. Delilah's pulse quickened, the knot in her stomach tightening as Cecilia's laugh echoed across the ballroom, followed by the flick of her fingers toward Everett's sleeve. Delilah tried to stand back, watching as Cecilia leaned in close, her voice too low for Delilah to hear. The interaction felt too intimate, too comfortable. Everett's face remained unreadable, but Delilah saw the faintest flicker of discomfort in his jaw. His ex was back, and for the first time, Delilah realized what she truly feared. Cecilia wasn't just an ex. She was the one who had once held Everett's heart, the one who knew how to break it, the one who could probably still do it if she wanted to. Delilah's hands clenched at her sides, and despite her best efforts, the sting of jealousy, of fear, began to seep through. She turned away, hoping no one would notice the way her heart had started to shatter. She wasn't supposed to feel this way. She shouldn't care. But deep down she did. She cared more than she ever had about anything, and it frightened her. She couldn't understand why it hurt so much to see them together. She had no claim on Everett. He had no claim on her. But the pull between them, the shared moments, the way he'd protected her, it was all beginning to feel too real, too deep. Stepping out into the garden for a moment of solitude, Delilah let the cool night air wash over her, hoping to calm the chaos in her chest. The soft rustle of leaves and the scent of jasmine couldn't quiet the storm raging inside her. But then she heard the faint sound of footsteps. A shadow fell across her, and before she could react, Everett was standing before her, his presence like a weight on her shoulders. His gaze softened when he saw the tear streaks on her face. "Delilah," he whispered, taking a step closer. She couldn't look at him, couldn't let him see how fragile she felt, but he reached out, taking her hand gently in his. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice gentle but full of concern. The way he looked at her, the way he held her hand, made it impossible to lie. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had no idea how to explain the ache in her chest. How could she tell him she was terrified of losing something she'd never even known she wanted? Everett's eyes softened with understanding, his thumb lightly brushing over her knuckles. "You're not just another employee to me," he said, his voice low, almost as if he was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince her. Delilah froze, her breath catching in her throat. His words echoed in her mind, reverberating with a truth she hadn't yet dared to accept. He cared for her, more than he'd let on. But before she could respond, her phone rang. Everett's expression shifted as he pulled his hand away, his face going blank for a moment before he answered. "Dad," he said, his voice suddenly tight. Delilah heard him mention something about a collapse, and she saw his entire demeanor change, the warmth vanishing from his eyes as the urgency in his tone grew. "I'm coming right now," he said, ending the call abruptly. For a moment, Everett seemed lost, caught between the world of the gala and the reality of the crisis at hand. "I have to go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be right back." He didn't wait for her reply before rushing out of the garden, leaving Delilah standing there in the cool night, her heart still racing. She was left with more questions than answers, her thoughts a tangled mess of what-ifs and what should-have-beens. Everett had just let down the walls around him, and now the world was crashing in, and she couldn't help but wonder if she was the one who had finally made him feel something real. For days, Everett was gone, vanishing into thin air without so much as a word to Delilah. His absence was like a gaping wound, one that she couldn't heal no matter how hard she tried. She had convinced herself that it was nothing more than a fleeting moment, that the fleeting connection they had shared at the gala was a product of the evening's emotions. Nothing more. But as the days dragged on, the silence between them gnawed at her. It wasn't just the lack of messages or phone calls. It was the ache in her chest, the burning question of why he'd abandoned her when she had just started to feel something real for him. Her mind raced with hurtful thoughts, each one more painful than the last. Had he left because he couldn't face his feelings for her? Or had he just been too scared of the possibility that something real could exist between them? She couldn't make sense of it, and the uncertainty was killing her. Back at the office, the rumors began to take root, spreading like wildfire. Whispers followed Delilah wherever she went, their cruel words cutting deeper than any betrayal. "She's using Everett to get ahead," they said. "She's nothing more than a gold digger." Each glance, each judgmental stare felt like a blow to her self-worth. She had never felt so small, so exposed. She wanted to scream, to demand they see the truth. But all she could do was sit there, feeling humiliated, wishing Everett would come back and defend her. But he didn't. It was as if she didn't even exist to him anymore. That afternoon, as Delilah sat at her desk, the weight of everything seemed too much to bear. She had worked so hard to get here, to prove that she belonged, only to find herself caught in a web of lies and rumors she had no idea how to untangle. The idea of resigning crossed her mind, leaving everything behind and starting fresh somewhere where no one knew her name. It would be easier, simpler, but the thought of Everett still lingered in her heart, an ache she couldn't ignore. Just as she was about to hand in her resignation letter, the door to her office opened. Everett walked in, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. The moment their gazes met, everything else seemed to fall away. The weight of his absence had never felt so real until now, and the tension between them was palpable. Delilah's heart began to race. She wanted to yell at him, to ask why he'd disappeared without a trace, why he hadn't even bothered to explain himself. But instead she stood up, the words choking in her throat. Before she could speak, Everett stepped forward, his voice low but filled with emotion. "Where have you been?" he asked, almost desperate, as if he'd been searching for her, as if he'd feared losing her forever. I I had to deal with things," he continued, his eyes flickering with something deeper. "Things with my father. I didn't know how to handle it. I didn't want to drag you into it." Delilah blinked, confusion swirling in her chest. She hadn't known. She hadn't known that Everett's coldness, his disappearance, had nothing to do with her at all. It was about his past, a past that haunted him, that pulled him away from her when she needed him most. The realization hit her like a wave, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. The anger she felt, toward him, toward herself, melted into something else, something raw and fragile. But the pain was still there. "You left me in the dark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what to think, Everett. I thought you were running from me. From us." The vulnerability in her voice seemed to shatter something inside him. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant but firm. "I wasn't running from you," he said softly, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to convey the truth that had been buried deep inside him. "I was scared. Scared of losing you before I even had you." Delilah felt the weight of his words sink into her, and for a moment the world around them seemed to freeze. She could see it in his eyes, the fear, the hurt, the desire that had always been there, but that neither of them had been brave enough to acknowledge until now. And in that moment, Delilah realized something she hadn't fully understood before. Everett wasn't just protecting himself. He was protecting her, too, protecting them both from the overwhelming emotions they couldn't control. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding as the distance between them began to close. But before she could speak, Everett turned away, his eyes clouded with a sudden shift in focus. "I have to go," he said, voice tight. "There's something I need to take care of." And with that, he was gone, leaving Delilah standing there, still reeling from the unexpected turn of events. She didn't know what to think or how to feel. The silence between them was unbearable, but it was also the space where everything was shifting, where everything was about to change. Everett's penthouse felt like a world apart from the chaos of the office, a quiet sanctuary bathed in the soft glow of city lights. Delilah stood by the window, watching the rain blur the skyline, while Everett silently approached her, his footsteps barely audible against the polished floors. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil inside both of them, yet in this moment, the tension seemed to dissipate. He hadn't asked her here for work, nor for any expectations. Tonight there was no business, only them. "Delilah," Everett began softly, his voice carrying a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "I've spent my life keeping everything inside. But you," he trailed off, gathering his thoughts, "you make me want to speak the truth, to let go of the walls I've built." Delilah turned toward him, her heart pounding a little faster as she sensed the rawness in his words. He was opening up in a way she never expected, and the gravity of it hit her like a wave. As the storm raged outside, the warmth between them grew stronger. Everett lowered his gaze, his fingers fidgeting with the sleeve of his shirt as he continued. I lost my mother when I was young, and after that, I promised myself I wouldn't rely on anyone. Trusting people was too much of a risk, but with you, it's different. Delilah's breath caught in her throat, her own wounds surfacing at the mention of loss. She knew that pain, the ache of losing someone so deeply, so suddenly. Her life had been a fight for survival, a fight to never need anyone. But here she was, standing in front of the man who had made her question that belief. I never let anyone close, she admitted quietly, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. But you made me believe that maybe, just maybe, it's worth the risk. The silence between them was thick, filled with emotions too powerful to articulate, but it spoke louder than words ever could. Everett stepped closer, his hand reaching out, his fingers brushing hers lightly at first as if testing the waters. Then with a quiet tenderness, he cupped her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her skin. Delilah's heart fluttered, her breath hitching as their gazes locked, neither of them daring to look away. He brushed her hair behind her ear, his touch gentle but deliberate. The air between them felt charged, not with expectation, but with something far more intimate, an unspoken connection. Slowly he leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was soft and slow, full of unspoken truths. It wasn't about passion or desire. It was about trust, about two people finding solace in each other's presence. As their lips parted, neither of them pulled away. Everett's hand lingered on her cheek, his forehead resting against hers, the quiet thrum of their hearts the only sound in the room. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The world outside felt so distant, so unimportant in that moment. Eventually, they made their way to the couch, where Delilah rested her head on his shoulder. They didn't say anything more, but their hands found each other, fingers entwining. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside they were safe. Wrapped in each other's warmth, they drifted into a peaceful sleep, the kind of sleep that comes with knowing that, for once, they were exactly where they were meant to be. Everett's heart raced as he stormed through the doors of the boardroom, his hands trembling from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had never been more certain of anything in his life. The board members were frozen in shock as he tore the contract to pieces, the sound of paper ripping sharp in the otherwise tense silence. If I have to choose between love and power, Everett's voice rang out, steady and defiant, I choose love, every time. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a decision he knew would change everything. He didn't care about the legacy they were trying to protect, the empire that had been built on the backs of those willing to sacrifice their humanity for the sake of wealth and status. It was all meaningless now. Delilah was his everything. Without her, there was nothing. As the board members sat in stunned silence, he turned on his heel, his mind focused solely on one thing, finding Delilah. He rushed out of the office, not bothering to take the elevator, as he charged down the stairwell, each step propelling him forward faster than the last. The train station was just a few blocks away, and every second felt like an eternity. His breath came in short bursts, his heart pounding as he thought of her. His Delilah, the woman who had brought warmth and light into his otherwise cold existence. He had been a fool, a coward to let her walk away, to let her think she wasn't worth fighting for. He wouldn't make that mistake again. When he reached the station, he saw her, Delilah standing by the train, a suitcase clutched tightly in her hands, her eyes red from crying. His heart twisted in his chest, the sight of her breaking him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He pushed through the crowd, his voice breaking as he called her name. Delilah! She turned, her eyes wide with surprise, but the pain in them was undeniable. She opened her mouth to speak, but Everett didn't give her the chance. He stepped forward, his breath heavy, his eyes filled with raw emotion. Without thinking, he dropped to one knee, ignoring the curious stares of the people around them. There was no ring, no grand gesture, but the words he spoke came straight from his soul. You walked into my life by mistake, but loving you was the best decision I ever made." Delilah's eyes filled with tears, and before she could say a word, she collapsed into his arms, pulling him into a desperate hug. She didn't care that the train was leaving, that the world around them was still spinning. Nothing else mattered but the two of them. The noise of the departing train faded into the background as Everett wrapped his arms around her, holding her close, his heart beating in time with hers. They didn't need the world's approval. They didn't need anything but each other. And as they stood there, in that moment, surrounded by the echoes of a life that had once seemed impossible, Everett realized that this was just the beginning. They were building something beautiful, something real, a forever that started with a mistake, but would last for a lifetime.